Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really diving deep into something, you know, very close to home. For you, it's Canada's immigration system. You send us this really incredible audio analysis, all in Mandarin, and we're so excited to break it all down with you, figure out what it all means.
Yeah, it's a really important topic. And, a lot of people are talking about whether or not the system as it is now is really sustainable, long term.
It's true, and it's interesting, right? Because it seems like just a few years ago, things were so different. People were really proud of how Canada handled immigration, called it a model system. What happened?
Yeah, I mean, Canada really did see it as, a win-win for everyone involved. Newcomers, they brought skills and perspectives that Canada needed. And of course, we can't forget about the huge impact on our culture. And Canada's always been this kind of cultural mosaic,
Right,
right?
absolutely. And we've always had so much space, such a small population compared to the size of the country. Immigration just made sense, helped us grow. Plus, we can't ignore the birth rate, right? It's been falling for years.
Exactly. I mean, all of those factors together kind of painted this really optimistic picture of immigration. But what this analysis really highlights is that while Canada was, kind of comfortable with this system, other countries were adapting, becoming more efficient.
So while the rest of the world was changing, Canada just didn't.
Well, that's what this analysis is suggesting, yeah.
Right.
And now Canada's being compared to like a dinosaur, this
Mm.
big, slow system that's just not able to adapt to the realities of today's world. And that has real consequences, not just for the immigrants themselves, but for everyday Canadians too.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people listening right now are probably feeling those consequences firsthand. This analysis connects this bottleneck in the system to a strain on public resources like, housing, healthcare, education. It even links it to the rising cost of living. Like, remember when groceries cost half of what they do now?
Yeah, it wasn't that long ago, was it? And that's just it. It's not just about numbers on a spreadsheet. This is about people's lives, their quality of life, and how the system impacts it.
It really is. And this analysis doesn't shy away from some of the more sensitive issues either. Like, it even suggests that this rapid population growth might be connected to other social changes.
Yeah, it brings up things like, petty crime, maybe people not following traffic laws as much as they used to, even a potential link to more serious offenses, though that's obviously a very complex issue.
It is complex, and it's important to remember that just because two things happen around the same time, that doesn't mean one caused the other. But it is something to think about.
Absolutely. It's all about context, right? Looking at the big picture. And a big part of that picture is just how many immigrants Canada accepts every year. I mean, in 2023, there were 471,000 permanent residency visas issued. That's huge.
That is a lot of people. But even with that number, Canada's population still grew by 1.2 million people that same year. I mean, that's a growth rate you see in developing nations. So where is everyone else coming from?
That's the million-dollar question. And this is where the analysis gets really interesting. See, it points to this often overlooked category, temporary residents. So we're talking about international students, people here on work permits, refugee claimants, and even those who came through that special program for Ukrainians, the CUAET program.
Well, right, the Canada-Ukraine Authorization for Emergency Travel.
Yeah, exactly. Now, officially, there were 2.7 million temporary residents in early 2024.
2.7 million, that's a lot.
It is, but the analysis actually suggests the real number is probably way higher. It might even be more than double that, potentially exceeding 4 million temporary residents living in Canada right now.
Whoa, 4 million. See, this is what I mean by deep dive. I had no idea. But that does make you wonder if there are that many temporary residents, what does that mean for the people who want to stay permanently?
That is the big question, isn't it? Because here's the thing. Not everyone who comes to Canada as a temporary resident is actually planning to stay forever. Some are here to study, some to work for a few years. But for those who do want to build a life here, well, it can feel almost impossible to navigate the system.
It sounds like it, yeah. So are we saying that the path to becoming a permanent resident is just really, really difficult?
That's what the analysis seems to suggest, yeah. It
Yeah.
can be incredibly competitive, very confusing, and for a lot of people, the stakes are incredibly high,
Hmm.
especially for international students who often come to Canada with the hope of building a better future for themselves and their families.
The analysis specifically focuses on Indian international students, right?
It does. It highlights that almost half of all international students in Canada come from India, and they often end up in these vocational programs. And while they're here to study, they're also working multiple jobs, facing huge financial pressure. Their future often depends on whether or not they can get permanent residency.
It's like this pressure cooker situation. So much uncertainty. It's no wonder we've seen protests, people just desperate for a chance to stay. But why rely on temporary residence so much in the first place? Why not just, make the process easier for those who want to stay permanently?
Well, it's a good question. The analysis actually suggests that this two-tiered system, where temporary residency is often like this stepping stone to permanent residency, it might actually be a way for the government to avoid having to go through Parliament to adjust the quotas for permanent residents.
Wait, really? So are you saying they're using temporary programs as a way to bring in more people without having to go through the normal channels?
That's one way to look at it. It's complicated, but the analysis definitely highlights how some groups benefit from this system, like universities and colleges who get those international student fees, businesses who can access a pool of often cheaper labor, and of course, landlords who see increased demand for housing.
It really does feel like a temporary fix for a bigger issue. And it kind of makes you wonder about this whole narrative, this idea that we hear so much about, the whole labor shortage thing. Because this analysis seems to challenge that, doesn't it? Like, is Canada actually short on workers?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. It's a big question because we hear it all the time, right? Labor shortage this, labor shortage that. But the analysis actually argues that this narrative, well, it might be a little overblown. Because when you look at things like the actual employment rate, the competition in a lot of sectors, it kind of tells a different story.
So then what's driving this whole push for certain types of immigration? Because the analysis specifically calls out those increased quotas for, childcare providers, construction workers, truck drivers, essential jobs, absolutely. But you don't need a 4-year degree for these roles, right? So what's the disconnect?
Right. You'd think if we were really that desperate for these workers, we would, try to make those jobs more appealing in the first place. But that's where the analysis gets really interesting. It argues that instead of addressing the root causes of these so-called shortages, Canada might be opting for the quick fix to bring in more workers from other countries.
It's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken bone.
Exactly. And they use the example of childcare because the analysis argues that it's not a lack of people willing to work in childcare, it's the low pay, the lack of support that makes it such a hard job, especially, with the cost of living these days.
Oh, absolutely. And, it feels like you could say the same thing about other industries, too. Like, the analysis talks about construction and how it's not that we don't have enough construction workers, it's that the whole system is a mess. Bureaucracy, the cost of materials, this insane demand for housing that's just pushing prices through the roof.
Right, and then people blame it on a lack of construction workers. Come on.
It's like, how can they even keep up?
Exactly. It's like trying to bail out a sinking boat with a teaspoon. The analysis even goes there with healthcare. You know how we hear about those long wait times? It's not just about a lack of doctors or nurses. The analysis points to deeper issues. Funding for training, recognizing credentials for professionals who trained in other countries.
So is this analysis saying that Canada is basically bringing in temporary workers for jobs that might not even exist? Or at least jobs that aren't as desperate as everyone's saying?
It's a bold claim, that's for sure. But they do highlight how many newcomers arrive here, all these skills and experience, ready to work, and then they can't even get a job in their field. It can be really disheartening,
It's like this bait and switch.
Yeah.
And the analysis actually uses a perfect example of this. It talks about the Home Child Care Provider Pilot Program.
Right, the one that gives foreign caregivers a path to permanent residency.
Exactly. Sounds great in theory, right? Except the processing time for that program. Over 2 years.
2 years? Are you serious?
Dead serious. That just goes to show you how broken the system really is. These people are here, they're working, contributing to our economy, but they have this huge question mark hanging over their lives. Can you imagine the stress?
I can't even imagine. No wonder people are frustrated. No wonder they're protesting.
Exactly. And this whole thing, this idea that the government is somehow in control of the entire system, they even call it a planned economy for people, which sounds a little, I don't know.
A little dystopian.
Yeah, exactly. So they're saying that instead of letting the free market do its thing, supply and demand, the government is trying to micromanage everything, like who gets to come here, what jobs they do, where they live. It's a lot.
It is. And the analysis argues that it's just not sustainable. Governments can't predict the future. They can't control every aspect of the job market. It's impossible. And frankly, it kind of misses the point. Like, why make it so complicated? Why not just set clear criteria for who gets to immigrate, based on their skills, their potential, and then let the market sort it out?
Right. Let people go where they're needed, where they can build a life. It makes sense. But if this whole planned economy approach isn't working, if it's as flawed as the analysis suggests, then what? What are the consequences for Canada in the long run?
That's where things get, well, a little bit scary, because the analysis paints a pretty sobering picture. They talk about a potential brain drain, where all those highly skilled workers, the doctors, engineers, scientists, they get fed up with the system, the bureaucracy, and they go somewhere else.
Oh, right. Like the U.S., we hear about that a lot.
Exactly. And meanwhile, at the other end of the spectrum, you have this oversaturation of the low-skill labor market, which ends up hurting everyone. It drives down wages, makes it even harder for people to get ahead. It's a vicious cycle.
It's like we're shooting ourselves in the foot. We need those skilled workers, but we're making it so difficult for them to stay. And at the same time, we're bringing in so many temporary residents that it's creating a whole other set of problems. It's a mess.
It's definitely complicated. But here's the thing. The analysis doesn't just end on a sour note. It suggests that Canada might be at a turning point, that people are starting to see the cracks in the system, that public opinion is shifting, and maybe, just maybe, that means we can start to demand better.
It does feel like, maybe there's some hope on the horizon.
I think so, yeah. But this is where we, the everyday Canadians, we have to step up. The analysis really emphasizes that this isn't a simple issue, right? It's not just about being pro-immigration or anti-immigration.
Right, there's so much nuance.
Exactly. And we need to be having these conversations, difficult as they may be, so we can start figuring out, okay, what kind of immigration system do we actually want? What actually makes sense for Canada, for the economy, for our social fabric?
That's a big question. So where do we even start? What can people listening right now, what can they do?
Well, for starters, educate yourself. This analysis, it's a great example, right? Dig into the facts, look at the data, and then talk to people. Have those conversations, even with people you disagree with. And, most importantly, hold our elected officials accountable.
Make them answer for the decisions they're making.
Exactly. Ask the tough questions. Don't be afraid to speak up. And when comes time to vote, well, maybe immigration policy should be at the top of your mind.
Right, because it's not just a federal issue either, is it?
Not at all. Provinces and municipalities, they have a huge role to play too, especially when it comes to those essential services. Housing, transportation, social support, it's all connected.
It really is. It's easy to get caught up in the headlines, the political back and forth, but this analysis really brought it home for me. Behind all the numbers, the policies, there are real people, real stories.
Absolutely. Families who just want a better life for their kids, students with big dreams, people who want to contribute to this country, make it even better. It's about finding that balance,
Yeah.
being welcoming, but also making sure it works for everyone.
It's a tough balance to strike for sure. Well, we covered a lot today, didn't we? We talked about the history of immigration in Canada,
Yeah.
how it's changed over time, the challenges we're facing, and hopefully some ways we can start to move forward.
Yeah, it's been a real deep dive.
It has. And it's clear this conversation isn't over. This is something that's going to continue to shape Canada for years to come. So to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this journey, for being part of this deep dive. Keep asking those tough questions. Keep the conversation going. And remember, your voice matters.